This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
2001: A Space Odyssey is one of the most important movies of all time. Today, I'm joined by Erik Fogg of the wonderful Reconsider Podcast to discuss this masterpiece of cinema. So at this point, I shouldn't even have to introduce Erik. If people haven't listened to the Blade Runner series that you presented with us, then drop everything right now, go listen to that, then come back.
It's iconic, yeah.
I'll just briefly introduce 2001: Space Odyssey, and then we'll jump right into it. So the movie is a 1968 film produced and directed by Stanley Kubrick, and it's based on a short story by Arthur C. Clarke. And Arthur C. Clarke wrote the screenplay. Now, I've read the short story, and it really does not prepare you at all for the movie. So don't feel like you have to read the short story to watch the movie. They're like completely different entities.
Yeah.
Now, it's difficult to summarize the plot of this movie. You really have to watch it and then maybe watch it again, then listen to this podcast, then watch it again. But we're going to address some of the key themes of this movie. And really the big thing to think about going into this movie is that it's broken down into 4 acts. They're connected, but they're not connected. We'll get into that.
Yeah.
So there's the far distant past on the African savannah, and the actors are a group of pre-human hominids. Then the second part is on the U.S. lunar base, which is supposed to be the present time, which was the future in 1968 and is the distant past now, 2001. Then we have the Jupiter space mission, which will feature the famous HAL, which I'm sure most people are familiar with. And then the final scene in the Baroque bedroom. So, Erik, where do we start with this?
Oh, my gosh. I mean, I think we need to provide some context briefly for those who haven't seen it. And for those who have seen it like 5 times, sorry, you're like, oh, my God, this is my favorite movie. Let's hear about it. Like, you can probably skip 2 minutes of this. But the thing about 2001 is that it's very non-traditional storytelling, right? Like most movies that we see have a coherent, singular narrative from start to end. And actually, there was a professor of mine who's actually a history professor, not a film professor, but he told me most sitcoms you ever see follow the path of the golden calf from the Bible, from the Old Testament, where everything's fine, everything's hunky dory. Right. But then people are like dissatisfied with their lot in life for some reason, and they get some crazy idea and they go execute it, and then things go terribly wrong, and then they have to fix it, which is like getting forgiveness from God. And then they're back to where they started, and they're more satisfied with what they had. And not every movie is like that, but you can explain a movie's plot typically with a few sentences just like that. And the way that we were struggling at the beginning of this episode said like, well, there's kind of a plot. Like, there's not really a plot. There's a sequence of things that happen. And so the typical plot of a movie is that there's this like core tension, right, that has to be resolved. And it could be like there are zombies and we have to survive. Like, that's the core tension. Or like spy versus spy. Or, these two people, they're in love with each other, but they're not good at communicating. So we now have a rom-com. And that core tension is not part of really 3 of the 4 acts. The Hal is a like Act 3 with Hal is a very classic, like it's a movie in itself, right? You have an AI that goes crazy and you have to like find a way to deal with it. And there's a lot of movies that are just like that. But Act 1 on the Savannah, Act 2. There is tension in Act 1, I guess. It's that like survival is hard, but it's not resolved in a conventional way where like a character makes a decision, et cetera. There's a very deliberate Deus Ex Machina that just goes like, okay, now it's different. Now things are different, right? Now the apes know how to use tools. Same thing with like visiting the lunar base. Like nothing gets resolved. They show up and then like, and it goes like, ee! And they like clutch their heads, and that's the end of the act. You're like, what? Why? Why did this happen? And then same with the Baroque bedroom. he shows up and he ages and then he's the star child and you're like, but why? What happened? And one of the ways I love that you talked about this, Steve, is that this is a movie that is about experiencing things, that like you are in the shoes of these characters experiencing what they're experiencing through this like audiovisual roller coaster or like tour de force. And it was one of the first, I mean, oh God, there's so much about this film that I love that's not just in the content, but how it's presented, about like the decisions that Kubrick makes and the innovations in visual effects, the musical decisions he makes, and the audio like controversial or not controversial, but like radical audio decisions, like having long periods of silence, all this stuff that's meant to just like have you be there, in order to experience, to your point, the themes of the movie. And often we experience a theme through seeing a story play out, and we go, that story, I reflect to it in, I resonate with it in my life. But we don't resonate with any of these stories, not in our lives. And so we experience the themes of the movie through radically different ways. And so like that is something that if you're going to go watch it for the first time or the second time, because you need to see this movie multiple times to appreciate it. You need to understand that, like, don't expect a plot in the way that you're conventionally used to, because you will find something missing. You have to approach this movie from another angle.
I like the idea of the Deus ex machina of the black obelisk or the monolith. I guess it's a monolith. It's not quite an obelisk, but it carries through, and you can kind of take it at first whack that it's a literal, that this is the literal thing from like an Alien, maybe, that like is the thing that gets people and humanity to the next like quantum leap in civilization. But it's also and I think more of a literary device of saying that we've made it to this point and we're ready for the next point in time and in evolution.
Yes. These monoliths show up after periods of extraordinary pain and strife with the, kind of like with humans interfacing with the world. Now, the second one, maybe not so much. But well, no, there is pain and strife, because like we see the monolith 3 distinct times. We specifically don't see it in Act 3. We see it in the transition from Act 3 to Act 4. So again, Hal is kind of its own story. That sets up why we go to Act 4. But yeah, in Act 1, the monolith comes in this period where, you see the early hominids, cowering in caves from hearing jaguars outside or saber-toothed tigers or whatever they are. And then they, and they get their butts kicked by another band of apes. And then the monolith shows up and like they're able to advance. And it seems like it's a good thing, but it's not even necessarily a good thing. It's just different now. Yeah, right. So like they're able to exactly. They're able to solve that problem, but like it introduces all sorts of new problems that you get with civilization. And the second monolith shows up during this period of like Cold War, between, on the Russian and the American moon bases. You feel this like low level, very civil, but the same kind of tension. And of course, like if we think of the themes, those two bands of apes, right? They're just called Americans and Russians now, right? And and in the first act, they're competing over like water. They're competing over like a little like pond of water, to get access to those resources. And now they're competing over the moon. And so like nothing's actually gotten better. It's just more advanced now. And then they run into the monolith again. And the Americans are the ones that got it, just like, and then they're able to send their people to Jupiter, just in the same way that one band of apes got the monolith and the other didn't in Act 1. And then we finally see the monolith again after the harrowing, traumatic ordeal with Hal, in which Dave is completely alone. And he runs into the monolith, and like life does not get better for Dave after that either. So the reason I think that's so important is that it changes the nature of this Deus Ex Machina, where typically it's kind of frowned upon. Like it's not a good storytelling device, because you go like, oh, well, this character didn't do anything to solve the problem. This is unsatisfying, but the problem's not being solved. But it is always there to sort of like address a pain or a tension.
that second act on the moon base, that really gave us a actual sci-fi scene of what Kubrick envisioned what approximately 30 years later would look like. And I thought that was and it was just so well done. Like, I think that's one of the things about this movie is that it really didn't, it's not like watching a lot of movies from the late 60s, early 70s. Like, I don't feel like this movie aged at all.
Yeah, that's one of the things that's so incredible about it is I'll show this movie to people and then I'll ask them, when was it made? And they're like, maybe the 80s? Like, there's not a lot of CGI, so maybe the 80s is like, no, man, 1968, 53 years ago. Everyone's like, right? Like, I barely know people that are that old. And that's not true. But he's such a master of visual effects. And the only thing that seems really odd about the visual effects in this movie is that he spends a lot of time on a single effect, right? So we're used to like visual effect, boom, 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 right? In some movies that I love, we do that. Like Fury Road is like bang, 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 bang. And you're like, I can't keep up. And this one, he's very indulgent, right? He like spends a lot of time, like with even just like with the waitress on the TWA spaceship, right? Like walking around the drum very slowly, right? Or then like floating very slowly through the passenger compartment. I mean, the ship landing on the moon base, all this stuff happens super slowly. And I don't know. I mean, some of it's just like, it's just the feel of the movie that look in, you're Kubrick's trying to help you experience that you're dealing with vast distances here. Right. And so you're not just like boop, popping from place to place in this starship. But it's also the case that I wonder how much Kubrick was just showing off, right? The guy is a big show off, and we need to like know a little bit about him as well, that he did stuff that people had never seen before. Like the idea of like this person walking upside down on the screen. Well, what he did was he had this big drum that was rotating slowly to be able to do that. But I was like, holy crap, or like floating. We'd never seen that before. We'd never seen a human floating in a scene as if in zero G. Or at least not convincingly. And
yeah,
and so you get these awesome, I mean, and I'm going to withhold talking about the Stargate, which is my favorite scene, but until we get to it. But yeah, what that means is like this pace is slow, and that slow pace makes it feel a little bit odd and out of time. But other than that, I agree, it's totally ageless. The guy, I mean, Kubrick's a genius. He's my favorite director.
What do you think that second act was for you? How was that getting us from the hominids to the Jupiter mission? Like, what do you think? How was that scene in that act meant to get us there?
It does feel very like it feels like a transition, right? It feels like it doesn't really justify itself. It doesn't stand alone. And I think that's intentional. So, and here's why. We know that, some of the music, or the music that's played at like the beginning and the end of the movie, is "Thus Spoke Zarathustra" by Wagner, right? And that's the music. It's the ba 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 bo 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 bo. That's "Thus Spoke Zarathustra." And if we've read "Thus Spoke Zarathustra," which I happen to have, one thing Zarathustra says is that man is a rope stretched between the animal and the overman, or the Übermensch, right? So Nietzsche sees man as a transition. Like we are an interstitial species between where we came from and where we're going. And there's this ultimate place that we are going. And we're in the middle of it. And that's why Act 2 feels so funny to us, because it feels like we're just passing through, right? Like we're on the starship and we're experiencing being on the starship. And then like there's the really tense conversation with the Russians, because we don't want to tell the Russians that we found a monolith. So we're like, oh yeah, there's totally a plague. And they're like, oh shit, this is a big deal. And then like we get to the moon, and then we have this conference that, oh my gosh, I forget our man's name, but he hosts this conference where he's like very authoritarian about it, and everyone's like very uncomfortable, but they're nodding along because they have to, and then they go check out the monolith and it screams at them, and then we're done. And so you kind of get at Act 2 going like, what's going on? But again, you have to remember that Kubrick is like, there's a reason he plays Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's not just because it sounds cool. It's because he's telling the story of the transition from animal to the Overman, the Star Child. And that's why it feels so transient the whole time. And again, the reason he spends a lot of time in it is because, one, he does want to paint you this, he's trying to do a few things at once. He's trying to paint this like awesome sci-fi vision, between the starship, the way station. It's a space station where like, you transition from one ship to another. The moon base, the little flyer going from the moon base to the site, and then the site itself. It's all great visual sci-fi. But he's also trying to do two other things. One, he's trying to recreate that conflict, that tension between bands of apes. And two, he's trying to show this transitionatory interstitial thing. And one of the reasons like we really know is that this is a transition is that at like the end of Act 1, right, when like the ape is like slow motion pounding away with the bone because he's like so excited that he's got this power now, he tosses it into the air, right, and it transitions into being the starship, right, and of course that's symbolic of like that moment was the beginning of this arc, this inevitable arc towards this new moment. And everything that kind of comes out of that is because of the monolith, like this inevitable extension of a series of events that it set off. And if you take the monolith symbol literally as these aliens are popping this thing here, which like it's in the movie, it's kind of hard not to, because like we don't meet the aliens, but we do get to the aliens' home, right? So like you get the sense like they probably did put it there that we had Act 2 is where man has finished this arc that started with that bone and ended with the lunar base. And and then the monolith, what they discover is that the monolith is essentially pointing to Jupiter. And so we can begin the like the journey. That's the Odyssey. Step 3 Act 3 is the beginning of the Odyssey. And and it's time to get to the other end of this tightrope between man and the Overmensch or the Ubermensch, and realize what man is meant to become. And so that's how I interpret Act 2. And I skipped over like all of the actual, it's where all the dialogue is, or most of the dialogue is. It's where most of the storytelling is. I mean, you have like our man calling his kid at home for some reason. Again, just to like, as far as I can tell, it's really just to show us Kubrick's vision of the future. And so if it feels a little odd, it's because he's trying to do 3 things at once, I think.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Then we get into Act 3, and for me, I think Act 3, in a lot of ways, I mean, it's really the power of the movie is told in that, and I think it's something that people probably when they were watching in the 60s was like, whoa, a talking computer, but that's like so insane fantasy. Who cares?
Right.
But if you maybe watch that in the early 80s, oh, now I have a computer in my house. And it's like it starts to get a little bit closer to you. Now, as we're moving into a time where AI is approaching something, maybe not quite a reality, but it's not, you can see that it's on the horizon. I think that at every different stage, people could have approached this at a very different mindset.
Yes.
What was that? Especially you've seen this movie over the course of many years. What does Act 3 mean to you?
I think it gets more real. It gets more real and more impactful as time goes on. It's not even really the rewatching. Like I can replay the whole thing in my head at this point. But it's the fact that, and I'm my day job is I'm the COO at a AI ML startup. Now we do like dev tools stuff, so there's no talking computers. It's just like code testing code. Code writing code that tests code is basically the idea. But there's a lot of AI stuff going in there. But I read about the industry and how it's changing, and there is some scary stuff starting to emerge where the fundamental problem, or the fundamental like ethical problem with AI, is that the whole way that it works. And again, for those of you who know, I'm sorry for belaboring the point, but the whole fundamental way that AI works is that you create some seed conditions and some like learning loops, and then you let it run, and it will update itself in ways that you can't predict. That's the whole idea. And so it's and all anything like the idea of intelligence is that it's making decisions, and like let's actually take a sec to think about this in a more in a more crunchy way. So like machine vision is a great example of machine learning. The way that the machine learns is because what's the machine doing? It's trying to decide whether, for example, I'm looking at a dog or a cat, right? And like we can extrapolate this out to like all the crazy things machine vision has to do to drive a car. But like let's just start with dog or cat. And so it has what it does is it has this kind of like cluster of statistical markers for like, am I looking at a dog or a cat? And just by like, by some colors and some shapes and some patterns. Again, it's not conceptualizing dog or cat. It's just saying that like this cluster of visual patterns gives me a certain probability that it's dog and a certain probability that it's cat. And if dog is overwhelmingly higher than cat in probability, it'll say dog. And how does it learn? This is the cool thing about these like neural networks is it learns by being wrong and being corrected. So it gets something wrong. It says, this is a cat. And then a human goes like, no, that's a dog. And so it updates the statistical model of dog and cat. And it just keeps updating that way. And so the difference between like machine learning and AI is that AI doesn't need, or like advanced AI, the dream is that AI doesn't need human feedback to teach it. And that's why it can just get feedback from the world. It can understand its objective. It's going to try something. Did it achieve the objective? Yes, no. If not, update and try again. And what that means is that, this kind of advanced style of AI frees itself from the need for humans to teach it. And so it can become smarter than humans. Or at least, smarter is maybe not even the right word. It can just start doing stuff that humans don't understand anymore, which doesn't mean smarter. It's just its own weird esoteric thing. And that's what happened to Hal. And so now that we like really start to understand the way that humans are starting to teach these machines to make decisions and iterate faster, we can see a plausible path to Hal. We can see, because Hal has had, one of the things that taught Hal, and with the amazing thing about Clark and Kubrick was they figured out that like one of the ways that Hal got trained was by having many, many, many conversations with humans. Now, maybe that's not so crazy because it's how kids get trained to be able to converse. But they understood that like the same kind of training thing happens by interfacing with humans. So Hal's pretty good at interfacing with humans. So anyway, I'm going on too much about AI, but it does, I think, make the Hal thing a lot more prescient. There's another angle that is more prescient over time that I only really thought about the last time I saw it, which was like, by the way, like 3 months ago. Even before we planned to talk about it, I'd re-seen it with someone. And what's really interesting about, in particular, Act 3 is the humans are very robotic. Now, this is also true in Act 2. You can kind of see it like even in the call with the kid, but it's even more true in Act 3, and it's intentional. The humans are like very calm and robotic. They almost look sedated. And you have 3 humans that are literally hibernating, and then you have 2 humans that are like pretty sedated. And Hal seems actually like my favorite part of Act 3. Well, not my favorite. One of the most striking parts of Act 3 is like the interview. So they have this interview like while they're in the ship leaving Earth. A news broadcaster is interviewing all 3 of the crew, the 2 humans and Hal. And like Hal's the most gregarious out of all of them by far, right? Hal's having these great conversations with this guy, and they don't seem particularly human, but he's certainly like more gregarious, more empathetic, more thoughtful, and the humans are a little wooden. And that's the other thing that I'm actually thinking more about. Not that we're going to become wooden, but that like our own experience with technology is making us a little bit less human because we spend so much of our brain cycles interfacing with machines rather than interfacing with people. Whereas Hal, all of his like human interface technology is taught by interfacing with humans, and the way he interfaces with machines is just radically different. So he's actually really good at it. And of course, at the end of Act 3, we're going to see that ability for him to interface come back when Dave is out to kill Hal, and you start hearing this desperation from Hal. And I've got one more like little anecdote I want to share about that. And of course, like that is of course my favorite scene of Act 3 is Dave, with like the red light all over him, slowly all you're hearing is his breath like right in his own helmet, right? Because you're there with Dave. That's the point. But he's going to kill Hal, and Hal is desperately trying to negotiate with Dave, like negotiate, beg, plead, cajole, guilt, all these things to try to get Dave to stop because Hal is powerless at this point. And so like what happens, how do humans act when they're powerless? And he's acting just like a human would. And I remember I've seen this in theaters a couple times. Like every time someone's like, yeah, we're putting 2001 up on the big screen, I'm going. And every time I've seen it just with another person, like me and one other person in the dark, we are dead silent through that entire scene. But every time I see it with audiences, people laugh. And every time Hal says something, people laugh. And it actually reminded me of another Nietzsche book, Birth of Tragedy, where it's the tension is so high that like in this collective group, we're actually not able to sustain it. Because Hal is so desperate, and we're so like we start to connect with Hal. Now he's a murderous, rampaging AI, but all of a sudden we feel his fear and his agony and his anguish. And so these audiences, we actually like laugh because we can't sustain that tension in a bunch of other people. It's just too much. It's too intimate. It is too intimate for us to be able to fully experience it in a big group of people. And so people, when Hal is saying, I've made a terrible mistake, Dave, and I'm very sorry, people laugh, and it's absurd. But I think that was intentional because it's just too much for us. And that's how human Hal is in some ways. Not in the same way as the replicants, who are very familiar human. Hal is still in the uncanny valley. He's still weird, and we don't like him, right? But we do feel empathy for his fear of death. And oh God, it's just so good. It's so well done.
I almost wonder if that whole third act was set up as a way, as almost like that outside force, the monolith of putting, and how Hal went on down to just Dave versus Hal. If who's going to go through this focal point of civilization and to go to the next level, these two different entities have evolved to this point. The AI, the computer, are they better than the human? They both can't pass through the point. Who's going to be the one to win?
I didn't even think about that, but it's just the apes all over again, isn't it?
Yeah, kind of. Wow. Yeah, I didn't even.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it really is.
Yeah, these two bands fighting each other, and the one who succeeds is going to get the opportunity to keep going, and the other one is going to die, right? Which is implied from Act 1, right? Like, of course, the apes who figure out how to use like stone tools, like they're eating better, and they can beat the crap out of the other apes.
Yeah.
That other band of apes is dead. They will not pass their genes on, and. And the final showdown between Dave and Hal, like one of them is going to continue and one of them will perish. Oh, cool. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, that's weird. I just thought of that now, but it seems, and it really shows that like the AI versus the HAL's intelligence. Maybe it's not quite proper to call it AI at that point, but his intelligence is a different intelligence than Dave, and I think that's really Dave throughout that entire conflict is. To me, at least, it's painted that Dave has no chance. He's not smart enough. He's not physically strong enough, but there's something innate to his humanity that allows him to win.
Yeah, it's his sheer will, right?
Yeah.
It's through sheer will. You even reminded me that in Act 3, at the beginning during the interview, Hal says he's just smarter than the humans. Right. I really like he almost sees them like children or pets that he has to take care of. And he's like, yeah, they're really cute. They're fun. Right. But he knows he's smarter. And so he, of course, outwits Dave. Outwits both crew members, both, awake crew members, kills one flat out. But because Dave's like in his own ship, Hal just locks him out, and he's like, boom, gotcha. Because Dave doesn't have a helmet. And like, you have this, I mean, I don't know about you, but every time I watch the scene where Dave re-enters the ship, like, right, I'm like gripping my seat, because again, it's in part because like Kubrick is so good at getting things to move slow. And he has these little moments of action, right? Of rapid action, but like this slow build up to it that Dave has to like blast himself out into space, right, into the black. And like somehow Kubrick knew that it was like plausible that you can actually survive in the vacuum for a few seconds, which is insane. But because I don't know how he would have known that, or maybe he guessed or got lucky. But that like tension there is incredible. And what it shows is like Dave's will to survive. And of course we empathize with that. Like Dave's not just going to sit there and die, right? That's not human. And Dave is going to do something. And it's Dave's like impetus for action and risk taking in order to try to survive. Like if he's going to go down, like he's going to go down trying. And he happens to succeed. He happens to be able to get in through the emergency airlock. And that was it for Hal. Now Hal's toast. And one thing Hal doesn't have, Hal also clearly had a will to survive, but he doesn't have the human ability to, like, he's trapped in the ship, and that's like the Hal's major disadvantage because he can't do anything, even though he's smarter than Dave. Like Dave has a body, Dave has, and Dave has like that human spirit that got him back in the ship. Again, and Hal could not have imagined it. And that's the important part. Right? Because, like, of course, Hal can plan for 10,000 possibilities. But one thing he did not ever imagine, and I'm sure, Hal, of course, knows there's an emergency airlock there, but he knew that Dave's helmet was off because humans can't go through space. I know that. But what he didn't know is that, like, humans are just that daring crazy when it's important enough to them. Yeah. And that was Dave's ultimate advantage. And that will to survive got him to the Stargate.
Yeah, I think that's probably like you hear about things like when that IBM computer Watson at Jeopardy, and a computer can plan for, and eventually a computer is going to be able to plan for gazillions of scenarios. But it seems like in humanity, the things that we remember are the things that you could just never possibly plan for in a million. It's the absolute farthest out, most inconceivable thing is the thing that happens.
Yes. And if we go back to Nietzsche, the Übermensch isn't powerful because the Übermensch is smarter than humans. The Übermensch is ultimately like more, it's just more, Nietzsche spends an entire like 800-page book trying to help us figure out what this future state of man that he conceives of is, right? We're not accepting that as true, but it's playing out in this story. But the Übermensch is like more human. The Übermensch is more morally powerful and good than humans. Has a like is valuable for his own sake, as opposed to is just smarter. And so we see Dave on display here. Like Dave is not smart. Dave is just, well, I mean, Dave's clearly smart because he's an astronaut, but like he doesn't win because he's smart. He wins because he's driven. And I think now that I'm thinking about it, I'm making this right now. I'm making this up on the fly, which like I was really good at my literature classes in high school because I could read a book and be like, oh, maybe it's this, right? And the teacher would be like, maybe it is, cool. And I'm doing that right now, but it does seem that it does seem telling that, because like one thing we know about Kubrick is that he's incredibly deliberate about all of his decisions, right? Every time he's interviewed, he's like, oh, here's why I did this like little tiny thing. And so like, why is it that the very last thing that happens before the Stargate is that like Dave blasts through space and kills Hal, right? He's willing to not murder, but like kill Hal in this like slow, excruciating, horrible way, right? That like you can't help but cry and he's just like taking these little memory drives out, right? But you hear Hal say, "I can feel it. I can feel my mind going, Dave." And you're like, how can you do this, right? But Dave is willing to just to survive, and that's that drive to live is what is what sort of earns him the right to be the creation that pops through the Stargate. And it's entirely possible, like if we think of the perspective of these aliens when they dropped the monolith, they either like didn't predict what would pop out, right, of that arc of humanity, or like they were fine with, they were kind of fine with knowing that there would be like biological intelligences and machine intelligences that pop forth from this, and like they're actually intentionally creating a crucible, right? That's like, and maybe that's why they intervened when they did, is you have this like very competitive evolutionary space, and they wanted that competition to like have the most fit, powerful survival machine pop out. Maybe, I don't know. Kubrick, as much as Kubrick is intentional about a lot of stuff, he also intentionally leaves a lot to the viewer to decide how they're going to interpret. And so everything we're talking about, like, I'm not telling you like this is what the movie was about. It's like how I experienced it and what I get out of it. And you're going to get different stuff out of it as well.
I think that was the best part. And I think that's in a lot of ways what Kubrick brought to the party, is that they didn't beat you over the head with the monolith. Yeah. It wasn't, in that way, it wasn't hard sci-fi. The monolith is a sentience from a foreign galaxy that does this, and this. Yeah. It's so much bigger than us, and it's bigger than Hal, and it's bigger than those hominids, and it's something outside of time, and we don't really need to understand it. We just know that it's there, and that's somehow the catalyst.
Exactly. And I think it's very intentional that it's a big featureless block. Like it's so black that it basically absorbs light. Like it doesn't even reflect stuff. It's just black. It's just empty. And yeah, I think that's super intentional. Of course it's super intentional. That like, no. Like you're never going to know anything about this. That's not the point. Stop worrying about what the monolith is or where it comes from. Like we never meet the aliens, right? And we know in Act 4 that there are aliens, that they've created this like Baroque room. And that's not even up for interpretation. Like aliens is not even necessarily the right word. It's the others. Like the others have created this Baroque room for Dave in order to complete his evolution into being, the Star Child. So we know that they exist, but we know nothing about them. And that's so important. Like these others being a mystery to us is so important to the story, because this is a story, like when we get it, it's called A Space Odyssey. Like, what's the Odyssey? Is it the trip to Mars? Well, kinda. Is it the trip through the Stargate? Well, kinda. Is it humanity's journey between Animal and the Overmensch? Hell yeah. Right? Like that is one big Odyssey. And it's about that journey as opposed to like, it's a little like if we think of Odysseus on the sea, right? Like there's a storm. Do we talk about why, there's a storm that almost takes him out? Does Homer talk about like, oh, what caused the storm? Well, there was a low pressure front that came through the Mediterranean and swept up into the Aegean and sent warm air. No, right? Or like they crash and there's a cyclops that wants to eat them. Do we talk about why there's a cyclops there? No. Do we talk about why there are harpies? No. It's a journey through all of these hardships that makes Odysseus into the king that he's meant to be. Right. So that when he returns to Ithaca, like he's the man that he needs to be to lead Ithaca. And these things just happened, and that's fine. And like, we're really into, I still love sci-fi that explains everything. Right. Like, like The Expanse, there's a little bit of mystery, but like the protomolecule, we learn a little bit about it, etc. That's fun. But like embracing the mystery because this is the Odyssey is really important to being able to like get the right stuff out of the film. And that's why Kubrick doesn't tell you about these external things. It's about mankind's journey.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Yeah, I think that's a thing that a lot of people would get hung up on is in 2001 and even in 2021 as we're recording this, there's no space airplanes and commercial space flight and moon bases or computers that can really talk back with you and have a conversation, but it doesn't matter.
Right.
The story, that is not what gets us through that Odyssey. And I think that's ultimately, even over and above the filmmaking, is what makes it timeless.
Yes, exactly. Much in the way that Homer's Odyssey is timeless. The technology in Homer's Odyssey is antiquated, and there will come a day when there are people who watch 2001: A Space Odyssey and they say that's kind of quaint. Because we're watching it from Mars, right? we're on Mars watching 2001: A Space Odyssey, saying like, isn't this cool where we came from? But it's still going to be timeless in the same way that Odyssey is timeless because it's a story about like the human elements of the story, of course, like and that's kind of the whole point of the story. Like these stories of struggle and competition and violence and survival will repeat forever. And having a destination at the end where you like become what you were always meant to be is something that we've always wanted and always strived for. And like Nietzsche articulated that desire to become something bigger than oneself so well. That this movie will last through the ages as something great.
I really think that's a hallmark of a lot of Kubrick's films is that, I mean, his last one was was around 1999 or 2000. And they're all very, even though, things have come along with effects and filming technology, you're so sucked into the story that those things don't even get in the way of the story.
Yeah. It's 1999. Eyes Wide Shut. Dang.
Yeah.
So I mean, the guy has such an awesome, such an awesome filmography, right? Fear and Desire, Killer's Kiss. Now, people are like, I haven't heard of those. It's like, cool, that's his early stuff. Spartacus, Lolita, Dr. Strangelove, 2001, Clockwork Orange, Barry Lyndon, The Shining, Full Metal Jacket, Eyes Wide Shut. And, we see his ability to, can you imagine, like Kubrick and Tom, the same guy who did 2001, just like working with Tom Cruise on like this like really sexy film, right? Everything is so different. But all these movies stand the test of time by far. And like, I don't even know what it is. I don't even know what it is that like that is like the common thread, because I've seen like Spartacus and Dr. Strangelove and 2001. And I mean, and all these, like, they're so different, but there's some like Kubrick magic in all of them. Where I think he understood his medium better than almost anyone, where it's a little like great Renaissance paintings or great, great, impressionist paintings. Like, they're not photorealistic. And like, we have technology to make things more photorealistic now, but who cares? Right? That's not why they speak to us. And they will always speak to us. Like, no matter, like, we'll be able to make holograms of stuff. We'll be able to inject imagery and sensations directly into your mind, right? And that technology will exist. And impressionist art will still speak to us, no matter how good the technology gets. And I think that was like part of Kubrick's true genius. And it was also, it helped him be a commercial success at the time, because something in 2001, people were like, how did you even do that? That's so cool, right? I've never experienced space like this before. It's always been like, before that, it was like Star Trek, and they had like the Starship Enterprise, like literally on a string, right? Someone's just dragging it across the screen. And you're like, what? And it was made, and that, like, and this is the difference between, Star Trek on a, the Enterprise on a string, and 2001: A Space Odyssey is like a couple years.
Yeah.
Oh, anyway, I'm just gushing now. I don't know if I'm saying anything useful.
Now we get into Act 4, and Act 4 is, I don't know if mind-blowing is the quite right word, but it's definitely, it takes you through a trip that is unexpected, and that's the whole setting of that is in one Baroque, like kind of sci-fi futuristic Baroque room, and it's, maybe you can set that scene up, because I'm not even sure where to start with it.
Well, we have to start with, of all the great things that Kubrick did in this movie, we have to start with what I think is his like coup of audiovisual storytelling, which is the Stargate, right? Which is, it's 9.5 minutes of just, it's the visual scenes are indescribable. And one of the things, like, dear listeners, like, next time you go watch this movie, or just like find the Stargate on YouTube, right? It's there. And like full screen, dark room, loud, right? You need the full thing. That's the point. And I want you to appreciate that, like, this man gets away with 9.5 minutes of just like rando, weird, like weird droplets of, like, I've actually intentionally not gone and studied how he made the visual effects for the Stargate, because I don't want the mystery taken away. But anyway, he has like weird German, like weird early 20th century German operetta singing of the like going on, as like, as what you're seeing is just this like these rando colors and shapes kind of like moving across your screen. And they're completely meaningless. And but he gets away with like, and unlike the Hal scene, every time I've seen it with an individual or with groups, everyone is slack-jawed, bug-eyed, still watching this whole thing for 9.5 minutes. And like, and try paying attention to any other one thing for 9.5 minutes in the year 2021, right? In like the age of Twitter, I dare you, right? But he still captures us. My favorite part of the Stargate scene, and like for the plot, all the Stargate scene is once he gets to Jupiter, he like falls into what is basically probably like a wormhole or something. Like, it doesn't matter what it is, but it's taking him from here to somewhere very, very, very different and far away. Where is that place? Who knows? Who cares? Right? It's radically different now. But my favorite part of the Stargate is like this middle part. So the Stargate itself is also broken up into 3 phases. There's the part where you like literally have these like walls flying by, right? And it feels like and how he even did that, I don't want to know, right? But and then at the end, it's it's clearly like footage of a plane flying over Terran. The movie making is like a plane flying over Terran soil with a camera, but then like, he uses all sorts of like weird negative effects, and so it's very surreal and alien. But the middle part, my favorite part about the middle part is like, again, I can't describe them, but it looks almost like you're under there's a microscope looking at like tiny little droplets or amoeba or something, but not that at all. But it's that there's this like slow movement and like goopiness that looks kind of like a nebula or kind of like a protozoa. And you actually, the thing I've appreciated about it after seeing it a dozen times is you have no concept of scale, right? Has Dave been shrunk down into an atomic particle? Or is this like through this like terrible vast expanseness of space? Like, are we looking at something that is less than a micron wide, or is it light years wide? You have no idea. And like once you like, if you can kind of like, if you can like, have this moment where you intentionally try to wrap your brain around the scale of what you're looking at so that you fail, you will appreciate what he's done so much. I just think it's and even today, like with a few exceptions, there are a few parts where there's like early CGI that looks like a little hokey, but those parts in the middle where he's using like organic as opposed to electronic stuff to create this, it will never get old. It will never ever get old, and like no CGI will ever be able to compete with its ability, because like when we're creating CGI, it's so intentional that we're trying to like, we're taking things that already exist in our mind and trying to turn them into reality using computers. So it's limited. Where what he did with the Stargate is I suspect there was some like, he like chose a technique and then allowed chaos to take over so that things could be created that we would never conceive of on our own. Anyway, it's amazing. And of course this breaks Dave. Like this experience through the Stargate, it's 9.5 minutes for us. It's probably it is infinity and it is a second, right, for Dave. And it breaks him. And so like he gets to the Baroque room, which is actually explained by Clark, is like the others, the aliens, the monolith makers, their attempt to, they've like kind of seen Earth from a distance and they're essentially trying to create like a little zoo for him, like in a comfortable place. And it's in the uncanny valley, right? It's uncomfortable. But he shows up there like shaking with his eyes rolled up in the back of his head, because he's been mentally shattered by this experience that like no human was ever prepared for. But he survives. And now he's in this Baroque room. And when he finally looks up, he doesn't look up. There's a future Dave, an older Dave, an aged Dave that walks in the suit and sees the pod with broken Dave inside of it. And part of that's to emphasize that like time is nonlinear here, right? So he's in this place where like time is nonlinear, space is nonlinear. All the rules that we understand them don't make sense anymore. And like Dave somehow has to just like accept being in this like essentially like weird, it looks like kind of like a hotel room of a madman, or like the hotel suite of a madman. And there's like busts of naked women that don't really belong. And it just like, it's the least comfortable place I can imagine.
The floor's lit.
Yeah, the floor's lit. Exactly. It like, oh God, it's unsettling. And I think, I'll wrap this up in a sec. I think the point of that room is, it of course brings Dave to his death so that he can become the next step, which is the Star Child. And what's the Star Child? Who knows? It's the Ubermensch. What is that? Who knows? But it's that I think part of the idea is that like there's no evolution without death. There's no growth without decay. There's no like to create space for something new, like the old things have to be destroyed. And Dave goes through this experience of being destroyed slowly and quietly. And it's this really interesting contrast to his furious will to live with Hal. Once he's reached the Baroque room, he is in like full acceptance mode. Right. And again, we have no idea like how much time there is for his mind to process all this. But he accepts his fate, and whatever's next. And then the monolith shows up one more time and he reaches out to it, and then boom, he's this like embryo in a giant sack in space looking at Earth with like big old bug eyes. And people are like, what's that? It's like, it's the Star Child. What's the Star Child? It's the Ubermensch. What's the Ubermensch? I don't know, but it's whatever's next.
during the second act, when our man on his spaceship, as soon as he gets to the lunar base, he calls his daughter on his birthday, and then Dave talks to his parents through the video phone on his birthday, and then we get that last where he dies in his birth. I think that is a theme that connects through all these, is birth and death and celebration of birth. And that death is this necessity to get to birth.
Yeah.
And we don't usually see it as that way in our day-to-day life. When you're dead, you're dead. When a baby's born, it's born. But there is that connection.
Yeah. I didn't even think about that, but you're right. Yeah, we see Dave getting like birthday wishes from his parents.
And I don't know if that's just, if you would read into it too much, that's just a foreshadowing of Dave's rebirth at the end as the Ubermensch, or if it's just something that, as we're thinking about it in the past, is that they just want to keep reiterating to us there's death and there's birth, and these things are normal. Even Hal dies.
Yep.
Everything has an end to it, but it also has a beginning. Like that hominid dying in the beginning led to the sun rising, and the ape is swinging the bone around that he killed him with.
Yeah. Nietzsche has this concept of the eternal return, and I keep leaning into Nietzsche because this is a story about the Ubermensch, right? And so like I'm assuming that Kubrick has intentionally a lot of Nietzsche themes. And so I want to read a quote from Nietzsche about this concept of the eternal return. What if a demon were to creep after you one night in your loneliest loneliness and say, "This life which you live must be lived by you once again and innumerable times more. And every pain and joy and thought and sigh must come again to you, all in the same sequence. The eternal hourglass will again and again be turned, and you with it, dust of the dust. Would you throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse that demon? Or would you answer, never have I heard anything more divine?" This is actually an abridged version of the quote that I found quickly, but I have to imagine that, and like the Ubermensch and the Eternal Return are both parts of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The Eternal Return is introduced elsewhere, but is a big part of what Zarathustra talks about. And I have to assume, and so like it actually seems like kind of a contradiction, and like Nietzsche is a very hard person to even understand, much less agree with. But because you have this sense of this arc, right, from one place to another, but also this sense of like eternal recurrence. So it's like both a straight line and a circle is like the arc of history. But we see that, and what happens when you combine a straight line and a circle? You kind of get a spiral, right? And you see this sense of like repetition, but like each time it repeats, it's bigger and weirder, and like the stakes seem higher. Because the first time it's just a bunch of apes bunking each other on the head with sticks. And then it's a bunch of like superpowers with nukes pointed at each other. And then it's like not even civilizations. Because again, like we can't even think of the monolith makers as like a parallel or analogous life force to humans. They're almost like demigods, but they're clearly not religious. We don't know what they are, and we're okay with that. Or at least we're meant to be okay with that. And but like that circle repeats itself again, where in order to take this next step, something must die and something must live or be born. And that is that is a theme here. And it's also just true. Like on Earth, if things didn't die, right? Like you couldn't grow because like things have to eat each other and stuff like that. Like maybe everything could be photosynthetic, but like then you would like all the biomass would become life and it would be over, right? There wouldn't be anything new because all the biomass would have been converted into photosynthetic life. But the fact that there's other life that destroys this life, whether it's bacteria or worms or carnivores or herbivores, allows new things to happen, allows this cycle to continue, and for like a growth to occur through the cycle. And and I didn't even think about the birthdays, but it does seem to be a bit of a thing, doesn't it?
So I think that we've given people a pretty good primer for this movie. How would you suggest somebody who's never seen this movie before and they want to go run out and get it tonight? How do you think they should watch it? Because it really is, you got to like set yourself up for this. This isn't watch it on your phone in the car.
Agreed. Yeah, never watch 2001: A Space Odyssey like on the plane when you're bored. Like the Avengers is great for that, right? And I've always watched it on the biggest screen I can get with the loudest speakers I can get away with, like the loudest volume I can get away with. I always want to watch it with a friend. I have watched it alone. Sorry, I always intend to watch it with a friend. I have watched it alone and really enjoyed it. But dark room, speakers pointed at you, big screen. This is meant to immerse. Like that's what this movie is meant to do. It's meant to immerse. Now it's also, how long is it? It's bloody long. Okay, it's 2 hours and 29 minutes. So it's not the longest movie on earth. But it feels long. And that's usually not a compliment. But like do prepare to like be fully there for 2.5 hours and like have no distractions. Because the slowness of it is meant to drag you along. Again, not just impart information, but bring you there. And again, like a couple things we talked about, like being in Dave's helmet where you just hear as he's going around, like that's a 10-minute scene and you're meant to be there with him, with his like rage and his pain and his fear and his like iron will. Right. And you're meant to be there with Dave through the Stargate. You're meant to, you're meant to be there with the astronauts on the lunar base as they're walking towards the monolith for the first time, as humans interface with it for the first time. Kubrick wants you to be there. And so it's a transporting movie. It demands a lot of you. But what's interesting is there are a lot of movies that like demand a lot of thinking in order to like keep up with what's going on and understand what's going on. This is kind of the opposite. Stop trying to figure it out. Right? Stop trying to like, you need to stop trying to figure out like, how are these like little things that I'm seeing telling me more about what's actually going on in the plot, right? The way you get with an Inception or a Tenet or something. There are things that are telling you about how this thing works so you can figure it out intellectually. You will not figure out 2001: A Space Odyssey intellectually. Kubrick never wrote it for you to really understand how and why certain things happen. It's like Homer's Odyssey. So you have to approach it with the same mindset of, I'm going to experience this so I can experience these themes and I can experience this journey and see how it changes you. And so again, dark, loud, quiet, big, and ready to just experience and receive rather than engage in like a play of like a back and forth play of like mystery and resolution.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Well, thank you so much, Erik, for presenting this to us. It was, I learned so much about the movie, and I think people should definitely watch this movie, listen. There's a lot of other resources out there too, where you can kind of engage with it, but listen to this podcast, watch it again, and you'll definitely get a lot out of it.
Yeah. Steve, I always have so much fun talking about this stuff with you. It's like, I'm not a movie snob, but I am like, I do appreciate them and I do like to really savor them. And it's like, it's just always such a ball, like with you and, and even with the audience listening, like just knowing that you guys are sitting here being like, oh yeah, I like that part too. Or like that spoke to me too. Or like, oh, like these little moments we have where we're like, I never thought about it that way. Right. That we discover stuff about the movie as we go through it.
Yeah.
It's always such a joy. And it's one of the reasons I love your show so much.
Thank you for listening to the Beyond the Big Screen podcast. A huge thanks goes out to our great friend, Erik Fogg of the Reconsider Podcast. Links to learn more about Erik and Reconsider can be found at reconsidermedia.com or in the show notes. A great way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on iTunes or Apple Podcast if you prefer. These reviews really help me know what you think about the show and help other people learn about Beyond the Big Screen. Speaking of social media, you can connect with me and other people who want to learn more about movies and much more on our Facebook and Twitter group by searching for A2Z History. You can contact me there or just send an email to steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Links to this and more can be found at a2zhistorypage.com. I will see you next time beyond the big screen.